The People Between, Dunmore's War and the Indigenous Struggle for Independence. A little bit about the title. What I hope to convey is a sense that during the 18th century, which you can argue pretty much the entirety of the 18th century was a struggle for independence for Native people in the Eastern Woodlands, that there is a convergence of forces that places the people of the Ohio country constantly in between competing forces. And so I hope to talk about that and talk about a little bit of the bigger picture. So one of the things about the conference today, we've had speakers who have talked on similar subjects. And so I told Jeremy and I told Nicole, I'm going to have to adjust a little bit because we're all talking a little bit about the same things. So I will make some of my comments briefer than I had intended about some things and try to provide a little bit more context, but also want to specifically focus on the convergence of forces that got us to Point Pleasant in 1774 with Dunmore's War. Before I start, I do want to make a shameless plug, and that is coming up next year. I am the co-curator for Virginia's signature exhibition for the 250th. So Virginia 250th signature exhibition, which is titled Give Me Liberty, Virginia and the Forging of a Nation. And myself and my colleague Harvey Bakari curated the exhibit. It's in a partnership with Virginia 250th, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. Now, I bring that up because Fort Gower is featured in the exhibit. Dunmore's War and Point Pleasant are featured in the exhibit. One of the objects we have for that is we do have Charles Lewis's powder horn is one of the objects. I tried to get Cornstalk's speech. There is the original document that is the recording of Cornstalk's speech at Camp Charlotte. It's at the New York Public Library. We got that loan was denied, unfortunately. So I want to use a facsimile of that. And by the way, I want to make mention because of this crowd, at the bottom of that recorded speech, it notes that it gave a belt of wampum. If any of you know where that belt of wampum might be, Jeremy wants to know, I want to know, so if anybody's got a lead on that belt, okay? So there's the shameless plug. So my interest in Dunmore's War is personal, and it has to do with family. In 1763, during Pontiac's War, one of my grandfathers, whose name was Jeremiah Carpenter, was captured during a raid, the raids that went down the Kanawha River to the Greenbrier settlements. Cornstalk was part of those raids. It's one of the earlier instances where he shows up in the historical record. They also go across into the valley to the Jackson River settlements, where Covington, Virginia is today. And that's where my grandfather was living as a child. He was 9 years old, and he was captured as part of that raid. And the records I have found say that he was taken back to the Shawnee Old Town. And as Jeremy has told you, there were several Shawnee Old Towns. So for the next 10 years, he lived among the Shawnee. We know that he comes back to Western Virginia in 1773. I don't know how. I don't know if he was repatriated, how he ended up back in Western Virginia in 1773. What is interesting, the very next year in 1774, he's at Point Pleasant. He was mustered into Captain John Lewis's company of Botetourt troops under Colonel William Fleming, and he's among that first group that goes out that morning at Point Pleasant. And I've thought about him a lot, and I thought about what he must have been thinking, what he must have been feeling that day. Was he conflicted? He just lived 10 years among these people. Did he even have a choice to go? If the folks in Botetourt County knew his story, knew that he spoke Shawnee language, he understood Shawnee culture, perhaps even some of the tactics, did he have a choice to go, or did they say, you're coming with us? I don't know that. I can only speculate. But that was the generated the interest in Lord Dunmore's War. But again, before we get started, first time to Athens, Ohio, beautiful city. This morning I came through town, hope to explore it later, crossed the beautiful Hocking River, and I just wanted to point something out culturally about the Hocking River. See, Hocking is a corruption of the Shawnee name for that river, which actually is the Hoctula River, which roughly translates to that TikTok girl river. Jason, your joke fell flat. So I told Jason if he clicked for me, I would tell his joke for him. So I got it in. Okay. So let's get started. So on your left, obviously, John Murray, the fourth Earl of Dunmore, the Viscount Fincastle, and the Royal Governor of Virginia. On the other side is the Shawnee Kishkalawa, who was a participant in the Battle of Point Pleasant. You'll see that he's also wearing a blue shirt. Native people were very savvy consumers in the fur trade economy. They knew what they liked, they knew what they wanted, and the traders adapted to that. And so this very popular form of blue became known as Shawnee blue eventually. So, next slide. A little bit about the Shawnee. They're Algonquian speakers, they're matrilineal. First contact is with the French in the 17th century, right? In La Belle Riviere, right? Homelands were located in the Ohio country, and there's a map to designate what that is in a minute. Known as great travelers, as Jeremy mentioned, diplomats and warriors. Next. So a couple depictions. The one on the left is from the 18th century, which Stephen had in his presentation as well. Again, you see that blue. The other is a more modern artist representation of a Shawnee man from the period. Red and blue. You'll see those colors over and over again. Red and blue, very popular together. And in fact, if you see stickball games today among some of the southeastern peoples and some of the folks in Oklahoma, sometimes one team will wear red shorts and the other team will wear blue shorts as cultural continuity. Next slide, please. So Jeremy didn't get into this too much, and I'm not going to either, but there is a diaspora of the Shawnee folks in the 17th century. Part of that has to do with the Beaver Wars and that Iroquois press out into other territories in order to have more territories to trap more beaver, get more skins for that trade. You know, among other things, they do have a technological advantage. They've been trading early and often with the Dutch and have firearm technology where some of the other folks don't. But by the time the Beaver Wars began, some of the Shawnee folks in the Ohio country have already begun to relocate other places. Some of them go south because they want more direct access to the trade with the Spanish and others. Jeremy mentioned some of the folks that end up in Georgia, and the river and the city, Savannah, that still carry that name and that connection. But there is a spreading out, right? Some folks go to the Illinois country, some folks to the east among their Delaware grandfathers, some to the south among the Cherokee and the Creek peoples. But I bring this up because by the time the Shawnee reconverge in the Ohio country in the 18th century, they have been gone for a little bit, and they are in no mood to go anywhere else. They are in no mood to leave their homelands ever again, okay? So I just wanted to point that out. And the other thing that this brings to mind to me is, you know, folks like Stephen have pointed out and others, is that the Shawnee, to my mind, they're like the connector people of the Eastern Woodlands because of their history and because they have been among so many other people, because they have family among so many other peoples. They become, diplomatically, they become a connector people. That's why it's no surprise to me that when you get into the later part of the 18th century, or even with the French and Indian War Revolution, and especially when you get to the latter part of the 1790s and then with the Tecumseh, that you see Shawnee people who are in leadership roles in these pan-Indian alliances. You can go back to the 17th century and see that they are connected to all these peoples, which places them in a particular position to have that diplomatic role and those leadership roles as well. Next slide, please. So this is roughly the Ohio country, although this needs to be amended. As Jeremy mentioned, definitely Kentucky needs to be included in part of that. I would stretch this into West Virginia to include the Monongahela River Valley and some other areas in southwestern West Virginia. But this is roughly the Ohio country in the 18th century. So when you read documents, references to the Ohio country, it doesn't just mean the present state of Ohio. It means Southwest PA. It means parts of West Virginia. It means parts of Kentucky and also Indiana. So, next slide. So as Nicole mentioned as well, Virginia's Western land policy in the 1740s and 1750s is to encourage people to go out there. They want folks on the frontier. They want that bulwark against native incursions, okay, into the eastern settlements. They want to establish themselves against the French claims to the west, right? So that is the policy, to send people out there, strengthen those claims, Who's out there, though? Mostly they are Irish, Scots, Scotch-Irish, and Germans who are recent immigrants who have no chance of getting any lands in the East. The English have already obtained those lands, so they have to go out to borderlands or on the frontier. Now, that's a term, as I recall from Nicole's YouTube video, that it's a loaded term, right? It's problematic. So I've been trying to use borderland more often because frontier, who's frontier, right? Next slide, please. So again, the people between. The French and Indian War is one of those first examples where imperial forces, the native people of the Ohio Valley, are going to be caught between these imperial forces. And, even though, like with the American Revolution, some folks try to stay neutral, increasingly the chances of neutrality dissipate, and eventually they are brought into this conflict. Now, the folks of the Ohio country, the native folks in this region, by and large, are going to side with the French. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. One has to do with the trade, right? I can't overemphasize the importance of the fur trade in this period of history. Who has the better goods? Who has the more reliable goods? Whose goods are more easily accessible? Okay, and a lot of times the French have better trade goods, right? In many instances. The other has to do, in my mind, with approach, too. Culturally, the French took the time to get to know native languages. They learned native cultures. They learned very early that it's easier to trade with family than with strangers, whereas the British didn't always take that approach. Certainly, there were several British traders in the Ohio country and who were very successful, but the French, because of their approach, had a lot of success in treating and trading with native peoples. So, in history we say, what were the motivations for the various European countries? With the French we say it was furs and faith, right? Furs and faith. They wanted the economy, the fur trade economy, and the monetary gain from that, and they also wanted to convert and proselytize among native people. Just like we say with the Spanish, it was God, gold, and glory, right? With the French, it was furs and faith. So, what did the British want? Everything, but especially land, right? So they're caught between this, and again, this is one of those instances, in some respects, what is the lesser of the two evils, when it comes to your choices in these conflicts? 1755 to 757, the borders of Virginia and Pennsylvania are hit very, very hard. In 1755, forces under Edward Braddock are routed at the Battle of Monongahela. That unleashes a flood of attacks on the frontier, which effectively pushes that population further back east. Some of those those western settlements are pushed back east. I recall reading one commentator who stated that he witnessed over 1,000 people cross that river in one day. That the river he's talking about is the Monongahela River, but it forces people back to the west, and there's a population shift. Next. So these are the pre-war and post-war boundaries for the French and Indian War. I just put this up here as a reference, but obviously, what's the problem with both of these maps? The French and the British are claiming territories that aren't theirs. Obviously, the native people who live there control these areas, but these were the pretenses of both of these empires and what they thought was their territory. Next slide. So, at the end of the French and Indian War, the French are defeated, but the native forces are not, okay? And there's a change in policy. So after the French and Indian War, British policy toward native people becomes a little more heavy-handed. I think of folks like Sir Geoffrey Amherst. And so the trade is curbed somewhat. There is a pulling back on the trade of powder and of shot. And so there is a resentment that begins to grow among those former French allies toward the British, and this is going to culminate in a multi-tribal offensive, military offensive, that, to my mind, is probably the most successful Indian offensive in history. Next slide, please. If you're not familiar with Pontiac's War, of the 14 British forts, 10 are taken by indigenous forces. And I can't think of an instance in history where there's a more successful military campaign than 10 out of 14 forts. Okay, we know that Pitt holds, Niagara holds, Detroit. Who am I missing? Stephen, who am I missing? Thank you. So, but otherwise, this is a very successful offensive. And the British are caught a little bit off guard by this, right? Next slide, please. Which in part leads to this. Now, this has been mentioned a lot today, and its importance can't be mentioned enough. The Royal Proclamation Line of 1763, as you know, was passed by the Crown, and it forbade settlement west of the mountains. It had two intentions. One was to keep settlers from going across the line into Indian territory, causing more conflict, causing them to have to spend more money to put down that conflict. But also, there was really seemingly an earnest intent for the British Crown to protect Native peoples, to protect their interest. The line was to both, quote, protect and awe the Indians, end quote. Protect and awe the Indians was the purpose of the Royal Proclamation Line of 1763. We know from our discussion earlier today with some other presenters that it did not stop anybody from going across the mountains. What it did stop was land speculation, okay? And this is going to be a proximate cause for the coming of our American Revolution, and certainly also Lord Dunmore's War in 1774. Now, when I went through school, public school system, I can recall learning about taxation and representation and those causes of the American Revolution. I don't recall ever learning about this. I don't ever recall learning that one of the principal causes, if not the principal cause of your American Revolution, was access to Western Indian lands, okay? That's something that we weren't really taught about. But I would submit to you, it is the primary reason for the coming of the American Revolution and for Dunmore's War. And much is made of the Stamp Act and all the other acts that would follow, but I would say that the most intolerable of all those acts was the Royal Proclamation Line of 1763. And oh, by the way, this is one way that Native people are a proximate cause in the coming of the American Revolution. How was that, you say? Well, the British ministry needed to pay for those 10,000 regular troops that it kept in the Americas following Pontiac's War and the French and Indian War to maintain this line. They had the audacity to expect the colonists to pay for their own protection. And that is why they passed the Stamp Act and some of the other acts and the resulting protest and turmoil that came from that. But you can see it is Native people who are a proximate cause in bringing about that tension with the Crown. There's a lot more that can be said about the Royal Proclamation Line, but others have spoken on it as well. But it cannot be understated the importance of this, okay? And there is a depiction of the line, as has been mentioned earlier. It did not follow, it's often mentioned that it followed the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. It did not follow the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. It followed the watersheds, okay? So this is more of an approximate rendition of that line. Next slide. We've talked about the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. We've talked about the Treaty of Hard Labor. Lochinvar has to adjust both. You know, Stuart's doing his thing in the South. William Johnson's doing his thing in the North, and the lines just don't match up. They're not where they're supposed to be. So we have to have Lochinvar to straighten that out. But as Jeremy has mentioned also, this myth of Iroquois hegemony in the Ohio country is mere pretense. Mere pretense. The Iroquois have no control in the Ohio country. They're trying to base that on the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. And I recall reading about these councils with Sir William Johnson. And in these councils, Johnson would say to the Iroquois headmen, hey, your dependents down the Ohio country, they're causing trouble. You need to go quiet them. And the Iroquois would reply, yes, we will take care of it. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. We'll take care of it. We'll go down there. We will quiet our children. right? Have you ever, I would challenge you all, have you ever read about, your students of this period, of Iroquois war parties going down to the Ohio Valley to quiet their children? Did it ever happen? No, it never did, because it's a myth of hegemony. A myth of hegemony, all right? Which is convenient for the Iroquois, as Jeremy pointed out. They're trying to relieve pressure on their lands, okay? And so they sold out the Ohio country from underneath the folks who actually live here. But if you, he's a dated historian now, but doesn't mean he's not good. But Francis Parkman writes a lot about the myth of Iroquois hegemony in the Ohio country, okay? Next slide, please. There's the boundary line. We've seen this slide already today. Next slide, please. Yeah, here comes the crux of it. Land companies. So gentlemen in Virginia have two principal ways to make an income. One is tobacco. Virginia is tobacco. The other is land speculation. And I'm here to tell you that every gentleman, all the names you know, had their hands in the Western Land cookie jar. All of them are involved in one or more of these companies, and this is not an exhaustive list of these companies. The Loyal, Greenbrier, Indiana, Transylvania, Wabash, among others, okay? I think about the Ohio Company, right? When I think about the proximate causes, or some of the causes of the French and Indian War, you cannot ignore the Ohio Company and their maneuverings in southwest Pennsylvania, right? This was one of the causes of the French and Indian War. Land companies, okay? But perhaps the most ambitious of them all was formed in 1773. The Grand Ohio Company, with the intent to create a new 14th colony in the West to be called Vandalia. Have you heard of Vandalia? Never heard of Vandalia? It was supposed to be the 14th colony. And in fact, in 1774, among the 12 lobby groups from different land companies who were in England seeking rights to Western lands, one of them was the Grand Ohio Company. And who was their agent at that time? Ben Franklin, who was also involved in the Grand Ohio Company, okay? These land companies have tremendous influence, right? And everybody is involved in them. By the way, who is, in 1774, Nicole, who's a silent partner in some of these land companies? His name is John Murray, and he's the royal governor of Virginia. He has, like John Connolly, he has a vested interest in Western lands, right? So you can see the stage is being set. These land companies are going to bring a lot of pressure. And we're going to talk here in a minute about those surveyors from those land companies as well. Next slide. So this is basically the outline of the proposed 14th colony of Vandalia. There was another colony also to be called Indiana, which would have been northern West Virginia, southwest PA. But this is approximately where Vandalia was to be. What's the big problem of that? Well, we know that the Shawnee still have claims to Kentucky and elsewhere. But this is the pressure that these land companies are bringing in 1770s. Next slide, please. Added to the mix, and this has been alluded to by others earlier today, is the Virginia-Pennsylvania border dispute. And this began in 1749. You know, Virginia's charter boundaries, if you're familiar with Virginia's original charter boundaries, you know, once when the world was Virginia, they extended quite far to the northwest, out to the west, to include lands not yet seen, including California, let's say. When I was working at Colonial Williamsburg, if I got a group who was from, say, Central California, I'll say, what part of California? Central California? Welcome to your colonial capital. Because that's Virginia, right? According to Virginians, Virginians have always been very ambitious. So 1772, all the British regular troops are pulled from Fort Pitt, okay? Virginia is going to rush in to fill that vacuum and claim that area as part of its original charter. Dunmore is going to send his agent, John Connolly, to take Fort Pitt and assert control for Virginia. This guy, he is the fulcrum. He is the nexus of so many things that are going to happen to bring about Dunmore's war, okay? He is, as been stated before, He is Dunmore's agent in southwest Pennsylvania. He's going to stir the pot. He's going to make a point to stir the pot. And what happens if we stir the pot and then Virginians have to defend the area? Oh, by the way, just like they did in 1763, Fort Pitt never fell, right? In 1763 during Pontiac's War, who was defending Fort Pitt in 1763? Virginians were. Virginians were at Fort Pitt, okay? And so similarly, they want to assert control. They want to defense of the area, they would be tantamount to possessory rights, right? So how are you going to do that? You're going to pick a fight. You're going to cause a war, okay? George Croghan, who was a Pennsylvania Indian agent, told the Ohio tribes in 1774, or 1773 rather, that they should whip and rob the Pennsylvanians you find, but kill all the Virginians. Lot of love, lot of love. Okay, next slide, please. So this whole dispute won't be settled until after the Revolution. Mason and Dixon begin running their line much earlier than that, but it is not until later that this is finally resolved, right? 5 degrees west longitude. People ask me as a native West Virginian, why does your state look like that? What is the purpose of that? Well, I say it's 5 degrees west longitude. Mason and Dixon went to where they perceived they were at 5 degrees west longitude and turned due north. That's why there's this perfect 90-degree angle here in southwest Pennsylvania. And that's why this finger of West Virginia that looks so ridiculous sticks out between Ohio and Pennsylvania, 5 degrees west longitude. But again, this goes back to that 18th century dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia about who controls the area. Next slide, please. The migrating multitude. As we've said before, the proclamation line of 1763 is just a paper barrier. And in 1774, there were approximately 50,000 settlers and hunters west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as has been mentioned, those encroachments brought about small-scale skirmishes along the borderlines, and this is a competition for resources. But as others have stated earlier today, skirmishes and engagements, small-scale firefights along the borders are nothing new, right? So why is 1774 different? Next slide, please. Yeah, these fellows, Jeremy mentioned them as well. And, you know, including Daniel Boone, who's probably like the archetypal long hunter, right? Long hunters. So who are some of the folks who are going furthest out and penetrating into native territories? They're not taking their families. They're not looking to settle and build a new life for themselves, okay? They're there to kill as many deer as they can and obtain as many pelts as they can for the commercial trade, okay? We haven't talked as much about the trade today, but if you're not familiar, the fur trade economy is huge. It's a huge enterprise. It's a huge economy that the native people here have been involved in for a long time by the 1770s, right? They want those goods, they need those goods, they are very involved in this economy, okay? But these folks are gonna cause all kinds of problems, okay? I read one description, Nicole, you've probably seen this one too, where they are described as men of the rougher sort. They are of the rougher sort, okay? And so they make no intentions about being, you know, interacting peacefully with the native peoples they might encounter while they're out there hunting, and they're going to cause all sorts of issues, because this is going to be one of the biggest complaints among the Ohio native peoples to Virginia and Pennsylvania officials is about their resources, is about these folks taking their skins. They are very involved in that economy. And when you look at the trade lists, if you ever have an opportunity to study trade lists, man, the amount of things that they're trading for, everything you can imagine, the tools, the clothes, all the things that they're trading for. So anything you can imagine a frontier white family having, the native people have it too, and probably some instances more of it than, because they are more directly tied in some instances to this economy. Next slide, please. And Jeremy pointed this out. This is the quote from Captain Will to Daniel Boone. But this is one of many instances of marked restraint on the part of Ohio native people to these incursions, okay? they're trying to get their point across, and they're trying to keep it peaceful, and that's why Boone's party is let go. Now brothers, go home and stay there. Now, Jeremy used this quote earlier today, but what I want to point out to you, this is just one of many instances where Shawnee and others are showing restraint in this situation, okay? Virginians are going to try to stir the pot. The Shawnee began to complain to Virginia and Pennsylvania officials that Virginians were, quote, killing all our deer and destroying our trees. When the Indians are disappointed in their hunting and find the woods covered with white people and their horses, where they used to find their game, some are foolish enough to want to make reprisals. This is about resources. This is about resources. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a part of this too. There's no authority out here. In 1772, when those regular troops are pulled from Fort Pitt, they are the last vestige of any authority out here. And so that leads to all sorts of problems, okay? Lawlessness and the lack of redress for grievances become another principal complaint. And one of the instances that I like to use to point this out happens in 1773. A man named Crabtree murders another native man named Cherokee Billy. Everybody agrees it was an out-and-out murder. And even though they found it abhorrent, no one was going to do anything about it. And I think this quote from Arthur Campbell kind of encapsulates that. Campbell wrote that, "I am persuaded it will be easier to find 200 men to screen him from the law than 10 to bring him to justice." So that speaks to about as much opportunity Native people out here have in seeking redress for their grievances, okay? Even if those white folks who are part of communities they are from recognize that this was abhorrent behavior. You might say, "Oh, that's terrible," and turn your back and not do anything about it, okay? So I'm trying to bring a convergence of forces together for you. You see all these things are starting to come together and the pot's starting to boil. Next slide, please. We've talked a lot about this, so I'll be brief. The spring of 1774, there's a flood of surveyors coming down the Ohio, okay? And Jeremy told you how Native people feel about them and their equipment. They know what that is. They know what they're doing. That's going to cause tensions to rise. There are some small skirmishes, which have been discussed earlier today. And then Connolly is going to stir the pot. How's he going to stir the pot? Well, Jeremy mentioned about the people being fired on at Fort Pitt. He mentioned some of the folks under Cressup who will fire on people as they're coming down the river. Many instances where they're taking shots and trying to stir the pot. But Connolly is the fulcrum. He is the main player in instigating a lot of this. And he is Dunmore's agent. So as you look at people who have commented on Dunmore's War, and they've written over the years, some have tried to make that connection between Dunmore and Connolly, right? And there are definitely connections. But what is not clear to discern is the extent to which Connolly is acting on direct orders from Dunmore or acting on his own, okay? We can only speculate, but we know that Connolly's doing everything he can to stir the pot. Next, please. And this is just a depiction of folks going down the river. I imagine in 1774, this might have been the scene with surveyors flooding down the Ohio. Next, please. Probably my favorite Robert Griffin painting. You guys know Robert Griffin. He has painted a lot of different things. But this one is titled, "I Think We Have Company," okay? And I'm telling you, in 1774, the Shawnee and the other folks in the Ohio country are fed up with it. They're fed up with it. And I can imagine this is the reception you might get. What's that? That's it. So, yeah, this is not what you want to see, right? If you're pulling up on the banks of the Ohio, especially the north bank of the Ohio, okay? Particularly men who are painted in that way. Because when you see the men painted in that way, that means they're in a certain mode. They're in a certain mode in which they have removed themselves from their towns and their wives and their children. They have prepared themselves. They have, depending on which people, different customs, different ways of preparing, but you can imagine planning the post, striking the post, singing the songs, going through those stages of preparations for some things you're about to do. And one of those things for preparation is to place this paint on your body, right? Black and red. Now, Native people painted for different reasons all the time, or for no reason at all, right? That bear grease can be used as a skin protectant, as an insect repellent, but if you mix it with some red ochre or vermilion, it adds a little bit of color. But when you see men painted in this fashion with red and black, yeah, you don't want to be pulling up on that bank. Because that's it. They're in a particular mode, okay? And to me, this is if we could talk about this just for a second, to me, I think this is important to understand. They're not painting up to be spooky and scary, okay? This is part of a transformation. These are husbands and sons, okay, who have families, but they have to prepare themselves to go out and do the things they have to do in order to protect their families. And that means they have to become the other. They have to become the person that has to do those things. But before they go back to their families and their towns and their wives and their children, they're going to wash that paint away. They're going to go and they're going to wash it away. And some tribes, I think about the Cherokee folks that I know and their history, they go to water and they wash it away. They wash it away because they have to go back to being a husband and a father and a son and a member of their community. So they wash it away. So when I think about this, it's almost like, to my mind, it's a native way of dealing with PTSD. It's a native way, it's ingenious if you think about it. It's a native way of dealing with PTSD because you become the other that has to do sometimes very nasty things. But you have to go back and be a son and a husband and father and in your community. And so you wash it away. You wash it away. Next slide, please. Not going to say a lot about this. This has been covered a lot. As Nicole and others have mentioned, not an uncommon occurrence in historiography, and that of all the descriptions we have of what happened at Yellow Creek, none are quite the same, right? So can we say definitively what happened today? Exactly, no, right? We have various accounts, some differ, right? But there are some common threads between them. But the impetus for that attack, as has been mentioned, was Connolly's circular. He sends that circular out, stating that Shawnees are preparing for war when they weren't. And in fact, during the whole spring and summer of 74, there are waves of diplomats who are trying to maintain the peace, okay? But Connolly is going to try to stir things up with this circular, and that circular is very important, okay? Who records this? The reception of this circular by Daniel Greathouse and his men. Oh yes, George Rogers Clark. Thomas Jefferson's golden boy, the hero of Vincennes, he's out here. He's involved, okay? And he records that when Greathouse and his men received this circular, they did this. The war post was planted, a council called, the letter read, and the ceremonies used by the Indians on so important an occasion acted, and war formally declared. The reception of this letter was the epoch of open hostilities with the Indians, okay? He goes on in this description to talk about striking the post, right? This fascinates me psychologically, culturally, that these men would take Indian-style preparations and customs of war and would enact them before they commit these atrocities. Fascinates me why they would do that, or how they would do that. And of course, we've talked about the massacre, but what I want to submit in the discussion today that has been had about this is this notion of corporate responsibility and why Logan and the relatives of those who were killed would seek reprisals, okay? In the native system of justice in the 18th century, corporate responsibility means basically this, otherwise known as the Morning War or blood vengeance. It means this: you kill somebody from my family, from my clan, from my town, it is incumbent upon me to kill somebody from your family, your clan, or your town. It doesn't necessarily mean it is the perpetrator of the act, because that is not quite as important as establishing balance. Corporate responsibility means balance. Why is that important at Yellow Creek? The men who perpetrated those acts at Yellow Creek, they've been around. They understand this system of justice. They understand the concept of corporate responsibility for the Shawnee and the others, okay? And they know, I'm submitting to you, that they know when they commit these horrible acts, they know what will come from it. They want that, okay? They want people to be in fear. When Logan launches his raids in 74, this is personal. This is a family matter. But Virginians are going to seize upon it as a wonderful PR piece to promote their agenda, okay? This is their opportunity to say, hey, oh my goodness, the war has begun. No, the war hasn't begun. Logan's reprisals have begun. And I think it's very telling that at one of those attacks, he leaves a war club with a note, okay? And that was a custom for some Native people to leave a war club or a tomahawk or something that symbolized basically a calling card saying, yeah, it was me who did this, okay? He leaves that club, he leaves it with a note, and it states, the Indians is not angry, only myself. Now this is important. The Indians is not angry, only myself, because Logan is trying to communicate that this is not a war by the Seneca, Cayuga, Mingo, Shawnee. This is a family matter. The Indians is not angry, only myself. He's making a point. He's thinking about what those Virginians or other folks could seize upon from his attacks. He wants to make sure he's clear, and he delineates that this is a personal matter, okay? Of course, Virginians are going to use it. They're going to run with it. People are afraid. They want people to be afraid. This was all calculated. This was all, as Jeremy said, this was all premeditated. This is the reaction that they wanted so that they could justify the coming war. Because, we must fight a just war. We must fight a just war. And we'll talk about the threat of war tactic here in a minute. Next slide, please. Again, Jeremy mentioned the sign. There it is. Up in Hancock County, West Virginia. Next slide. Again, much has been said of this today, but I just want to point out that the Shawnee sent waves of diplomats, and they used Alexander McKee, who is a Pennsylvania Indian agent, who is Non-Helemus' son, right? Cornstalk's nephew. They use him to make overtures of peace. And so what I want you to understand is that throughout that spring and summer, they're trying to maintain the peace. Cornstalk is trying to maintain the peace all throughout, okay? Virginians aren't. They want this war. They're going to have their war, okay? I thought it was interesting that on June 10th, the same day that McKee reports the Shawnees are all quiet now, Dunmore reports that, quote, there are good grounds to believe that the hopes of pacification can no longer be entertained. These are very divergent views on the same matter, right? That's the same day in 1774. And has been mentioned, August, Virginia forces under McDonald attacked the towns in the Muskingum, the first official action of the war, right? Point Pleasant wasn't the only battle, as Nicole has pointed out. Dunmore orders Lewis to form the Southern Army, and he heads to Pittsburgh to form the Northern Army. Next slide, please. I'm not going to say much about that because we've talked about this before. I will say that I followed, as I mentioned to someone earlier today, I followed history to get here today. I left my house in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I drove up through Stanton, Virginia, which would have been, I think, Augusta County at that point. I drove down through Lewisburg, and I stopped and got something to eat and some gas at Camp Union. I followed the Kanawha River partway to get up here to the Ohio country. So I kind of followed history to come here to be with you today. Next slide, please. Again, this is a depiction of the battle. I'm not going to say much about the battle. It's been talked about earlier today. as Nicole was giving her presentation, I was thinking, man, what can I point out? One of the things which I think is interesting, does anybody know who's credited that of the two guys who were followed the Ohio hunting and stumble upon the warriors? One makes it back, right? One doesn't. Do you know who shot the guy who didn't make it back? Who's credited as drawing first blood at Point Pleasant? His name was Taverner Ross. And Taverner Ross was an adopted white. He was an adopted white among the native folks in the Ohio country. So if that is true, then the first blood at Point Pleasant was drawn by an adopted white, which I always found very, very interesting. Okay. Next. So this is, how many people have been to Point Pleasant? So this is the flood wall at Point Pleasant, okay? And what I like about this is that if you're standing there actually looking at it, it gives you some sense of the scale of this battle, right? This was no small skirmish. This was a major, major engagement. And so this one just shows the Virginia troops on this one. Next, please. Here's a close-up of one of those flood murals. And I put this in here because I want to point out to you that the Battle of Point Pleasant was a nasty scrap. At one point in the day, it became very, very personal, and there were many instances of hand-to-hand combat, right? One of the Virginians remarked that about the bravery of the warriors running up to the muzzles of their guns, right? This wasn't people necessarily shooting from behind trees, although that happened. At one point, it became very personal and became hand-to-hand, okay? Treaty of Camp Charlotte established the Ohio River as the boundary. The captives, as were mentioned, were part of that negotiation, and those more formal negotiations took place at Fort Pitt in the spring, and those Shawnee hostages were sent to Williamsburg to ensure good faith. Now, in the past, at Colonial Williamsburg, there were programs that depicted the arrival of the 4 Shawnee hostages that were sent to Williamsburg. And I think they're attempting to resurrect that now. I'm not sure how I feel about that. And I'm sure Jeremy's got some feelings about that too. But we'll leave that one right there. Next slide, please. Again, this is one of those flood murals that depicts Camp Charlotte. Next slide. So this is what I tried to get from the New York Public Library that they wouldn't give to me for our exhibit. And the reasoning was it's a 2-year exhibit, okay? So if you want to see Give Me Liberty, Virginia and the Forging of a Nation, it opens at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond in March of 25. So coming up, that's not important. What is important is that in 2026, the exhibit will be at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. But because it's a 2-year exhibit, they declined to loan it for that length of period. You know, paper, you have to rotate paper, and that's just too long. So there will be a facsimile. But hey, gave a belt of wampum. Who knows where it's at? Next slide, please. And this is a more recent depiction of Colonel John Gibson and Logan's lament. And at Camp Charlotte, Logan was notably absent, and Dunmore wanted to know what was up, where he was, right? And so he sent Gibson to look for him. Gibson returns with a very famous speech, right? Next slide, please. So the aftermath. It's the first direct cession of land by indigenous peoples from the Ohio country. It kept the borders quiet for 2 years as colonies prepared for revolution, allowed for settlement in the West, which would serve as a bulwark in the Western theater of the Revolution. And let's talk a little bit about how it is one of the first instances of the threat of war tactic. So the threat of war tactic, that terminology, that concept was first put forward by an ethno-historian named Anthony Wallace. And Anthony Wallace said that the threat of war tactic goes like this. You instigate, provoke, and instigate the Indian people until they finally have had enough and they retaliate. When they retaliate, then you can say, oh, it's an uprising, it's a war. And then you are therefore able to execute a just war against them. But what I want you to understand is the threat of war tactic is the formula by which manifest destiny will march its way across the continent. you will see it, what I just described to you will happen over and over and over again, okay? So before I get beyond Point Pleasant too far, I would like to ask you, was anybody at the commemoration of Point Pleasant last month on October 10th? Was anybody there for those commemorative events at Point Pleasant? Consider yourself very lucky. As a native West Virginian, I was embarrassed, I was disgusted, I was disheartened. So, what should have been a very meaningful, what could have been and should have been a very meaningful commemoration was instead an orgy of white celebration. Not only during the course of the events of that day, all the dignitaries, speakers, representatives, not only were there no tribal representatives present on October 10th for the 250th Point Pleasant, Native peoples were not mentioned by anyone, not once. It was recorded. I think it's available. Don't watch it unless you want to be upset. You know, as a West Virginian, we have to battle stereotypes often about our people. A couple of those is that we're insular and that we're backward. And the events on October 10th last month only reinforce those notions. And I'm here to offer an apology on behalf of the great state of West Virginia. It was ridiculous that Native people were not mentioned one time, not once, in the course of that celebration. Oh, and it was not a commemoration. It was a celebration, okay? All right, I'm getting up my high horse here for a second. 1777. Who here has heard of the year 1777, referred to as the year of the Bloody Sevens? Okay, things got quiet for a little bit after Point Pleasant, but it didn't take long for them to get stirred back up. What is one of the things in 1777 that's going to be a powder keg? What's going to be the spark? Cornstalk goes to Fort Randolph as a peace diplomat to let them know, hey, heads up, there might be some trouble brewing. And they say, well, you should stay here. And they take him hostage, he, his son, and another Shawnee. Unfortunately, because of an incident further down the Ohio, a group of frontier Virginians come to Fort Randolph, murder all three of them, murder Cornstalk, right? Which is one of the reasons that 1777 is the year of the Bloody Sevens, okay? But again, caught between competing forces when it comes to the American Revolution, most of the Native people of the Ohio country are going to side with the British against the Americans. Who is the lesser of the two evils? And certainly at that point, the biggest evil are the Americans. Next, please. Okay, I was going to remove this because this is bombed in the past, and my intention was to remove it, and I just now realized I did not remove this slide. Okay, this is because this is heavy stuff, right? We're talking about warfare. We're talking about this conflict. It can be heavy. This is for levity, right? So there are people in Point Pleasant who believe that as he died, Cornstalk placed a curse on Point Pleasant. Some of them go so far as to say that the Mothman is a manifestation of Cornstalk's curse. That the collapse of the Silver Bridge in the 60s was because of Cornstalk's curse. I think that's that's for levity, folks. That's for levity. And I meant to take that out. So next slide, please. Here's what I want to point out to you. That even though it's considered a victory for the Virginians because they stayed the ground at Point Pleasant, the fight is not over. The fight will continue for quite some time. Blue Licks, Harmer, as Stephen mentioned, the biggest defeat of Native force. When I teach in the classroom, I'll ask my students, what is the biggest defeat of an American army by Native forces? Little Bighorn, Custer, not even close. Arthur St. Clair's defeat in 1791 by far. Of 1,200, I think the casualty was 900 out of 1,200 killed or injured out of St. Clair's troops, okay? The biggest defeat of the U.S. Army by Native people. Fallen Timbers, Tippecanoe, and then comes in the War of 1812. Okay, here's another thing that I want to point out. I think it's very important to put in perspective for the big picture, and I am trying to give a little bit more of the bigger picture. When you consider some of the skirmishes that occur between Virginians and the Shawnee beginning in late 1740s, certainly blowing up in the 50s during the French and Indian War, and when we consider the fact that in 1814 at the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh is defeated by the forces led by who? Who leads the forces that defeats Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames? William Henry Harrison. Wait, the Harrison family from where? From Virginia. 60 years later, from the 1740s and 50s to the death of Tecumseh in 1814, the Shawnee and Virginians are at each other, right? 60 years. So, and I like to point that out because you have generations of Shawnee and other Native people in the Ohio country who grow up. They're born, they live, and they die knowing nothing but these conflicts. So I ask my students sometimes, I'll say, do the times make the person, or does the person make the times? And of course the answer is yes. And so, is it any surprise to you that a young man whose father is killed at Point Pleasant, who knows nothing but consternation and fear, having to move, have to be on guard, have to be always tension, right? That's all he knows. Is it any surprise that you see someone like Tecumseh emerge in history? The times make the person, and the person makes the times. Again, we don't know what Tecumseh looked like. There are a couple portraits of him. None of them are going to be accurate because nobody knows, but this is an actual portrait of Tenskwatawa, his brother. Okay. Next slide, please. Anytime I give a presentation, okay, and I tell our staff at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, when they talk about Native people, if you're doing a program or a presentation about Native people, you must end the message in the present, because there is a tendency to relegate Native people to the past. So I want to do what I preach to our staff, and that is end the message in the present. Wow, the boys are a lot bigger now. This is an old picture, okay? The Shawnee people are still here, the 3 recognized Shawnee tribes in Oklahoma, okay? Their cultures are vibrant, and they're doing quite well, thank you very much. And they are beginning, there's something happening in Ohio, and as Jessica pointed out, I was at Hale Farm for 3 years as a director, and recently watching things happening in Ohio with Caesars Ford Theater, Great Council State Park, with the commitment of the Ohio History Connection to do more engagement with the Native peoples who are ancestral to Ohio. There's a current, there's a movement, there's an energy, things are happening. The people are coming back, and it's happening. I see it, okay? So stay tuned.